In about half an hour, my son Andrew will sit across from me in a small restaurant and explain, in a calm voice, why he spent 3 years quietly ruining every job I tried to get. He will say it as if he had a reasonable explanation, as if the whole thing were simply a practical decision. At that moment, he will not know that my husband's letter is already in my purse. But the story did not begin there. My name is Vivian Lockhart. Until a few years ago, my life was ordinary in a way I never thought much about. My husband Daniel handled most of the financial planning, and I worked part-time when I wanted to, mostly small administrative jobs around Columbus. It was simple, and it worked. Daniel died 3.5 years ago. After the paperwork and the quiet weeks that followed, I realized I needed to find steady work again. Nothing complicated. Something with regular hours. Something that would help me stay independent. The third cancellation happened on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a small cafe in Clintonville. The phone call was polite and brief. The woman from the medical office said they had decided to move in another direction. That was the third time in 6 months. 3 times I made it to the final stage. And 3 times the opportunity disappeared just as it seemed settled. I wrote the date in the small notebook I had started carrying with me. I had begun doing that recently, mostly to keep track of things. Sometimes writing something down helps you see it more clearly. What bothered me was the timing. Each cancellation came shortly after Andrew asked where I had applied. At first, I dismissed the thought. It felt unreasonable to connect the two. Still, the pattern kept repeating. And once I started noticing it, I could not easily stop thinking about it. The next interview was scheduled for the following week, and that was the morning someone placed a printed email in front of me and asked a question I was not prepared to answer. The following week, I went to the interview I mentioned at the end of the last chapter. It was at a logistics company near Easton. The office was quiet and simple, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a window looking out over a parking lot. The hiring manager studied my resume for a moment before looking up. "Lockhart," he noted. "Were you married to Daniel Lockhart?" I nodded. "Yes. He passed away a few years ago." The man leaned back slightly. "Your husband helped me secure a small business loan about 15 years ago. I remember that clearly." For a moment, the conversation felt easier. Then his expression shifted, and he reached into a folder. "There's something you should probably see." He hesitated, then turned the printed email so I could read it. After I finished, he asked whether I wanted a copy for my records. The sender's name was visible at the top, Andrew Lockhart. My hands went still for a second before I picked up the paper. Attached to the message was a document titled Medical Concern Report. The email explained that I might be experiencing cognitive decline and that hiring me could create financial risks for the company. I read it once, then again more slowly. When I finally looked up, I kept my voice steady. "May I keep a copy of this?" The manager nodded without hesitation. "I almost withdrew your application because of it," he explained. But something about the message felt off. I thanked him for being honest and finished the interview as calmly as I could. The rest of the conversation passed in a blur. At one point, I remember thinking that my husband would have handled a moment like that better than I did. Outside in the parking lot, the quiet shock began to settle in. 2 days earlier, Andrew had asked me, casually, where I was interviewing that week. That night, I placed the printed email beside the notebook where I had been writing down the canceled jobs. The pattern I had been noticing suddenly looked less like coincidence and more like evidence. Looking back at that first year, I realize how perfectly Andrew played the role of the grieving, protective son. Every time I applied for a job, he was there with helpful questions, offering to vet the companies for me. Each time a job offer vanished, he was the first to console me, whispering that maybe I was just getting too old for the stress. I blamed myself, never suspecting that the hand holding mine was the same one stabbing me in the back. I had practically handed him the keys to my life, even letting him organize my digital world after Daniel passed. Another detail returned to me that night. Andrew often helped me organize my email after Daniel died. I had been grateful for that. I opened my laptop and checked the saved accounts. His account was still saved in my browser, and my email had been set to forward certain messages to an address he controlled back when he was helping me organize things after Daniel died. That was the moment a quiet possibility began to form, one I had never seriously considered before. During the second year after Daniel died, Andrew's tone with me began to shift in small ways that didn't seem important at first. One afternoon, he was speaking with a neighbor outside the house. I was close enough to hear part of the conversation through the open door. "My mom's been forgetting things lately," Andrew mentioned casually. "I'm starting to worry a little." The neighbor gave a polite laugh. I stepped outside and joined them. And Andrew smiled as if the comment had been harmless. "You know how memory works when people get older," he added. At the time, I brushed it off. Families tease each other. That's what I told myself. A few weeks later, I noticed something unusual with the vitamins I took every morning. The pills looked slightly different from the ones I had been using for years. I brought the bottle to a pharmacy on my way home from running errands. The pharmacist looked at the tablets, checked the imprint code, and came back more serious than before. He told me the pills in the bottle did not match the supplement listed on the label and appeared to be a prescription sedative. He advised me to stop taking them and speak to a doctor right away. Sitting in my car afterward, I started replaying the last several months in a different light. I sat in my car for a while afterward, holding the small bottle in my hand. I tried to think of another explanation, but the list of people who had access to my kitchen was short. Andrew visited several times a week. When I saw him later that evening, I didn't mention the pills. Instead, I watched him more carefully. At the time, I told myself he was being insensitive. Later, I began to wonder whether he was collecting moments he could use to make me look unreliable. "Just capturing memories," he joked. I nodded and let him continue. Later that night, I wrote everything in my notebook. Dates, comments, small details that had started to form a pattern. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility that felt deeply unsettling. Andrew might not just be interfering with my job searches. He might be trying to prove that I couldn't manage my own life anymore. The house Daniel and I bought many years ago sits in Upper Arlington, a quiet neighborhood where most families stay for decades. Daniel arranged the paperwork carefully before he passed away. The property was placed into a family trust that allowed me to live there for the rest of my life. Andrew would inherit it only after I was gone. At the time, I never questioned the arrangement. Daniel handled legal matters with a kind of quiet patience I always admired. One evening, Andrew came over carrying a folder. "I've been thinking about the house," he began while setting the papers on the table. "It's a lot for you to manage." "I've managed it for years," I replied. He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "This would make things easier if you sign it. I can take care of finances and maintenance." I read the heading slowly. Power of attorney. Andrew continued explaining. "We could sell the place eventually. You'd move somewhere smaller. Less stress." I placed the document back on the table. "I'm not signing that." "Signing?" He studied me for a moment, then closed the folder without arguing. Later that evening, I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen and heard Andrew talking on the phone. His voice was lower, but the house carries sound in a way older homes often do. "Once the paperwork is done," he told the person on the other end, "the house situation will be easy." I stood there quietly for a few seconds before stepping away. Back in my room, I opened the notebook that had been following me everywhere for months. I wrote one sentence across the next blank page. Andrew wants control first. The house comes after that. It was the first time the thought felt clear enough to write down. 2 weeks after the conversation about the house, Andrew returned with the same folder. He placed it on the kitchen table as if nothing had changed. "Have you thought about it?" he asked. "I have," I answered, "and I'm not signing it." His expression tightened slightly. The calm tone he usually used disappeared. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I don't see it that way." Andrew leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You can't manage everything alone, Mom." bills, repairs, taxes. It's not realistic. I've been managing. For now, he replied. But that won't last. There was a long pause before he added quietly, "You won't survive without help." The words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. Later that night, I packed a small suitcase. I took the notebook I had been writing in, the printed email from the employer, and the bottle of pills from the pharmacy. I didn't leave a note. At that point, explanations felt unnecessary. I drove downtown to an emergency placement the hotline worker had helped arrange. It was temporary, plain, and quieter than my own house had felt in months. The next morning, a social worker sat down with me to go over what had been happening. She listened carefully while I explained the past 3 years. "This kind of situation happens more often than people think," she told me. "Financial pressure inside families can become abuse." I showed her the documents I had collected. Later that evening, my phone vibrated with a message from Andrew. "This doesn't need to get ugly," he wrote. "If you sign the papers, I can get you into a small apartment and make sure you're taken care of." A minute later, he sent another message. "Staying in a shelter is no way to live." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. My own son. The boy I had raised was mocking my displacement while holding my home hostage. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a sharp, icy clarity cut through the sedative fog. I took a screenshot and sent it directly to the legal aid attorney with a single note. I sent the screenshot to Karen and wrote only, "He still thinks this is about pressure. It isn't anymore. It's about proof." Karen didn't just see a family dispute. She saw a tactical financial assault. We spent the next week turning my suspicions into a legal fortress. We didn't just have the sedatives and the fake medical report. We secured recorded admissions from my former prospective employers. One manager even played back a voicemail where Andrew, sounding staged and mournful, claimed I was in the advanced stages of cognitive decline. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of his greed. The pattern was undeniable. Andrew wasn't just waiting for his inheritance. He was actively trying to manufacture my incompetence to seize it early. During our next meeting, Karen asked something I hadn't expected. "Did your husband ever leave any legal protections in place for you?" I paused before answering. Daniel had always been careful about financial matters. He rarely explained every detail, but he liked preparing for possibilities. "There might be something," I said slowly. Years earlier, he mentioned a bank lockbox connected to the family trust. He told me I could open it if I ever felt pressured or manipulated. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. Now the memory felt more important. Karen nodded thoughtfully. "Let's see what your husband left there." A few days later, I met Karen outside a bank branch in Short North. Daniel opened the lockbox there almost 20 years earlier. I had never needed to look inside it before. The bank employee verified my identification and led us to a small room. A metal box was placed on the table, and the employee left us alone. Inside were several documents arranged carefully in a folder. A copy of the family trust, a business card with the name of Daniel's attorney, and a handwritten letter. I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. The letter was brief and direct. The letter wasn't just a farewell, it was a roadmap to a trigger clause Daniel had embedded in our family trust. He wrote that he'd seen a streak of greed in Andrew that worried him. The trust included a forfeiture clause Daniel had clearly discussed with his attorney. If a beneficiary tried to manipulate or coerce the surviving spouse in certain defined ways, that person's future interest could be revoked. It wasn't automatic, it would have to be established and enforced. But Daniel had left behind more than a warning. He had left a mechanism. He mentioned Andrew by name, not as an accusation, but as a possibility Daniel believed we should prepare for. I read the letter twice before handing it to Karen. "He didn't predict what would happen," I told her quietly, "but he clearly worried about Andrew's attitude toward money." Karen nodded while reviewing the trust documents. "The clause is very specific," she explained. "Fraud, coercion, or interference with your independence could trigger it. I placed the evidence we had already gathered on the table beside the trust papers. The emails, Karen continued, and the messages you saved are strong. But one thing would strengthen this even further. What's that confirmation that Andrew knowingly interfered with your employment? She suggested arranging a conversation with him. Somewhere public, she added. Somewhere witnesses can listen if necessary. I thought for a moment before answering. Daniel used to take me to a small restaurant in German Village every anniversary. The place was quiet but busy enough that a conversation wouldn't attract attention. If Andrew thinks I'm ready to give up the house, I told Karen, he'll probably speak openly. She closed the folder and looked at me carefully. Then let's give him that opportunity. The meeting took place at a small restaurant in German Village. The same place Daniel and I used to visit every anniversary. I arrived early and sat at a table near the back. Karen and a private investigator were already seated 2 tables away, quietly finishing their coffee. Andrew walked in carrying the same folder I had seen weeks earlier. He sat down across from me and placed the folder on the table. "I'm glad you finally agreed to talk," he began. "This situation isn't working." "I know," I replied. He opened the folder and slid the documents toward me. "You can't keep living like this," he continued. "No one's going to hire you. It's time to be realistic." I looked at the papers but didn't touch them. "You want me to sign again?" I said. "It's the practical solution," Andrew answered. "If you sign the power of attorney, I can start controlling the bills, the accounts, and anything tied to the property. From there, selling later would be easier." I waited a moment before asking the question Karen and I had discussed. "Did you warn those companies about me?" Andrew leaned back in his chair. "Someone had to," he replied. "They deserved to know what they were dealing with." "What exactly did you tell them? That you've been forgetting things? That you shouldn't be responsible for financial records?" He spoke as if the explanation was obvious. "I was protecting them from mistakes." At that point, 2 chairs moved behind us. Karen stepped forward with the investigator beside her. Andrew turned sharply. "What's this?" Karen placed a small recorder on the table. "This conversation has been documented," she explained calmly. "Mr. Lockhart, your statements may trigger serious consequences under the Lockhart Family Trust, and we will be addressing that formally." Andrew stared at her. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. Karen opened the trust document. The clause is very clear. Attempts to manipulate Mrs. Lockhart's independence allow the inheritance to be revoked. Andrew's confidence faded quickly. He looked at me, then back at the documents. For the first time in several years, the balance between us had shifted. I stood up, thanked Karen quietly, and walked toward the door. The legal process didn't happen overnight. Karen explained early on that these things take time. And she was right. Over the next few months, the documents from the trust were formally reviewed, along with the evidence we had collected. Andrew tried to challenge the situation at first. His attorney contacted Karen and argued that the conversation at the restaurant had been misunderstood. But the evidence was clear. The emails he sent to employers, the messages he wrote to me, and the recorded conversation at the restaurant showed a consistent pattern over the following months. Daniel's attorney and Karen worked through the trust procedure formally. After the evidence was reviewed, Andrew's future interest was declared forfeited under the terms Daniel had put in place. Andrew was removed as the future beneficiary of the house Daniel and I had lived in for most of our marriage. The property stayed under my control, exactly the way Daniel intended. Without that inheritance Andrew had counted on, his financial plans began to fall apart. Around the same time, information from the trust dispute reached his employer through documents he had not expected to become part of a legal record. Once they understood he had been contacting employers to undermine his own mother while trying to gain control of her assets, they opened an internal review and suspended him pending the outcome. Word spread through the family faster than I expected. People began calling me, sometimes quietly asking what had really happened. I kept my answers simple. The situation spoke for itself. Legally, I could have gone back at any time. Emotionally, I wasn't ready to walk back into rooms where every surface reminded me how long I had doubted my own judgment. Instead, I rented a modest apartment near Worthington. It was smaller, but it was peaceful, and every decision inside it belonged to me. One evening, my phone rang while I was making tea. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. I watched it for a moment before answering. "We can fix this," he told me. His voice sounded different now, quieter. "I don't think we can," I replied. There was a long pause before he spoke again, but I ended the call before the conversation could circle back to the same arguments. After everything that happened, one lesson stayed with me. Respect and trust inside a family can't be forced through control or pressure. They have to exist on their own. Andrew still calls sometimes, his voice thin and desperate. Stripped of the inheritance he thought he deserved, I don't answer. I've learned that a home isn't built of bricks and mortar, but of safety and respect. Daniel knew the son we raised better than I wanted to admit, and he loved me enough to protect me from our own blood. If someone you loved used your vulnerability as a weapon, would you have the heart to disarm them? Or would you keep waiting for a change that might never come? Let me know in the comments.